Good afternoon here on the East Coast. I'm Garrett Graff. I'm the director of the Cyber Initiative here at the Aspen Institute, and welcome to Expect the Unexpected. With voting underway already in many states and about 2 weeks until voting ends and the hard work of counting and certification begins, we want to spend some time today diving into the issues that government officials, advocates, law enforcement, journalists, and all Americans may be affected by as our democracy meets together over the next couple of weeks. Today, we'll hear from three speakers with perspectives on major issues like cybersecurity, mis- and disinformation, and election administration and denialism, who will each speak briefly about their own expert topics, and then we'll engage together in a broader conversation. I'm pleased today to be joined by Matt Masterson, the Director of Information Integrity at Microsoft, Nicole Tisdale, founder of Advocacy Blueprints and former Director of Legislative Affairs for the White House National Security Council, and Tammy Patrick, Senior Advisor to the Elections Program at the Democracy Fund and former Federal Compliance Officer for the Maricopa County Elections Department. Unfortunately, Dr. Kathleen Ballou of Northwestern was not able to join us today, so it'll be just the three, Nicole, Matt, and Tammy. A few bits of housekeeping before we get started today. We'll take questions from the audience at the end today. So at any point during the conversation, as you think of questions or topics that you want to raise, you can drop those questions, comments, and topics into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you are watching on Zoom. Please include your name and affiliation if you are comfortable. Thank you also to the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for their support of our work on democracy and media today, and two other Aspen digital events that I want to let you all know about in the weeks ahead. We hope you can also join us November 3rd at 7 p.m. virtually for a program about disinformation and the midterm elections co-hosted between Aspen and 92Y. With founding CISA director Chris Krebs in conversation with Cecilia Kang of the New York Times. This is a preview event of the Aspen Cyber Summit, which will take place in person in New York City on November 16th, and a free live stream is also available for that if you are not able to join us in person in New York. More details will be made available in the chat. So, on to Expect the Unexpected. Our first briefer today is Matt Masterson, who currently serves as the Director of Information Integrity at Microsoft and was previously the Senior Cybersecurity Advisor at the Department of Homeland Security, where he focused on election security issues. He previously served as a commissioner at the Election Assistance Commission and held senior staff positions in the Ohio Secretary of State's office. Matt, what are you worried about today?
Well, first of all, Garrett, thank you for the opportunity to be on this event, to talk to you all. Thanks to Aspen Digital for continuing to highlight these important issues. For me, I continue to not only be worried about, but also encouraged by the response of our election official colleagues across the country and voters. Less than 2 weeks before the 2022 general midterm election, we see some really encouraging signs about our democracy. Participation is robust. We see record turnout in places like Georgia with early voting and absentee voting, and rapid participation really across the country. We see election officials and poll workers resiliently pushing forward to administer a fair, accurate, and secure election, and continued robust support from all levels of government, nonprofits, and the private sector, all pushing forward to secure our democracy. So what are the security risks we're seeing, and what actions are being taken against these? There's really three areas. They've been discussed a lot, but they've evolved over time. Those are cyber threats. Those are physical threats against election infrastructure, and then information operations leveraging those. Election officials have always taken security seriously. Before 2016, election officials were already working to secure systems and their offices and their personnel. But what we see now is a more dynamic information environment that seeks to leverage doubt, distrust, and dissent about the elections process, largely driven by untruths about how elections are run in the United States, to drive a conversation aimed at pursuit of financial and political gains, whether or not the damage being done to democracy is taken into account. As we look at sort of the timeline of this risk evolution, when we look back, I sort of look back at 2016, with an eye towards how quaint it almost feels now. We were focused on Russia and nation state targeting our cyber infrastructure of elections, right? Targeting voter registration data in an attempt to undermine confidence in our elections process. In response to that, election officials, the federal government, and others robustly invested time, resources, expertise to improve the security and resilience of our election systems. Throughout 2017, 2018, of course, we had the designation of critical infrastructure by DHS for election systems and other steps. So then we get to 2020 and we see those cyber threats remain. And certainly we saw activity from nation states like Iran and Russia targeting 2020. But then we started to see physical security and even health of election officials, workers, and voters come into focus. And election officials did what they always do, which was respond robustly to ensure a secure, accurate election in 2020 that was also safe for voters, safe for them and their workers, while prioritizing and managing the risks around the process. Coming out of 2020, obviously, we saw the unfounded claims and this information environment and the combination of perceived cyber risks or even lies about the cybersecurity of the process combined to mobilize and push threats, physical threats against election officials and others. So you have the physical security all within an information ecosystem that's being driven to push out or at least scare election officials and workers in the job that they're trying to do. So as we approach 2022, my main concern is the physical security and safety of election officials, as well as the additional support that could be provided to them so that they can show voters in a very tangible, real way that the election is secure, that it has integrity, that they are safe to go vote, and that, in fact, the best response to these narratives is a robust participation in our democracy, whether that's getting out to vote, whether that's participating and watching pre-election testing of the voting systems or serving as lawful observers under the state laws. Or participating as poll workers. The best response to this doubt, distrust, and dissent, this push to undermine our democracy is robust participation from Americans from across the political spectrum, from across blue, red, big, small, medium counties. So as we move forward and sort of think about what we might see in 2022 and what steps continue to be taken and need to be taken, we need to think about these issues jointly, not as a pillar of cybersecurity, a pillar of physical security, a pillar of information security, but recognize that each one of these play together to create defense in depth, and that those who are seeking to sow doubt or distrust leverage each one of these to push narratives to our voters to cause them to be fearful, frightened, or doubt the integrity of the process, all of which isn't true. And so this defense in depth includes continued investment in our cybersecurity, continuing to have robust implementation of multi-factor authentication, network segmentation, incident response plans that include not just cyber response, but physical response, better coordination between election officials and law enforcement to ensure the safety and security of workers at election offices and at polling places, recognizing the now present risk or real risk of insider threat that may be present within certain elections offices, and evaluating what steps can be taken to ensure that access controls are in place, that we have proper chain of custody procedures, that we're able to transparently display to voters that not only was the process secure, but we could show you the evidence of that security, that we had access controls and processes in place for controls of the ballots, of the registration process, of tabulation, and of post-election auditing. And one needs to look no further than some of the partnerships that have been formed in the aftermath of 2020 and into 2022. Things like the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections, which brings together state and local election officials, law enforcement, nonprofits, academics, and the private sector to not only bring together and help secure the process, but then go talk to voters where they are in their localities, in their states, about the security of the process and the fact that they can not only go out and vote safely, but their vote will be counted as cast. moving forward. And so as we progress in this discussion, as we progress towards Election Day, and perhaps most importantly, the aftermath of Election Day, I would stress the following three things to any voter, to any reporter, to anyone that's listening, that the election in all 50 states, the 5 territories, across all 8,800 jurisdictions is being administered by election professionals who are natural risk managers, who ask themselves the very question of this event: what could go wrong? How do I respond? What plans do I have in place? And what else do I need to prepare for? Not only that, but the process is transparent. All 50 states, 5 territories require and have transparency laws in place around the process, and it's administered in a bipartisan or multi-partisan way. The political parties are involved as observers. The political parties are involved in a variety of ways, including in some places auditing, canvassing, and observation. And so this bipartisan, transparent process administered by election professionals across the country will be secure, it will be accurate, and it will have integrity. And so the best response for all of us is to get out and participate in it. Thank you, Garrett. I appreciate the time.
Thanks, Matt. Great summary. As I said at the beginning, we're going to be taking questions from the audience after all of the briefings. I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative here to ask you a question here before we move on. Matt, Secretary Mayorkas today was speaking about DHS and its role around election integrity. And one of the things that he said is that DHS doesn't have a lot of authorities around elections, but that it has a lot of capabilities that it can bring to the table. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what those capabilities are and what is the role of DHS in this very sort of disaggregated national election system.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I agree completely with Secretary Mayorkas. The elections process is owned, operated, and run by state and local election officials across the country. They're the ones with the authority. They're the ones with the expertise and know how it's done. But DHS and really the federal government as a whole have robust capabilities to bring to support those state and local election officials. And those capabilities were brought to bear long before this discussion or even this midterm election in the form of things like physical security reviews of local election offices. So DHS has protective security advisors across all 50 states that have gone out and literally been on the ground in election offices reviewing the physical security protocols and practices in local election offices by invitation of those locals, right? So you've seen local election officials, state election officials really engaged. Cybersecurity services, things like penetration testing, vulnerability assessments, tabletop exercises. You've seen DHS engage with thousands of state and local election officials across this country to really assess, okay, where do the risks lie? What are the possible mitigations to those risks? And what steps can we help you take to mitigate those? And this is critically important, not just because of the security of the process, but also because it empowers election officials to go talk to their voters about the facts of the security of the process, the steps they've taken to implement multi-factor authentication, network segmentation, access controls, physical security controls, chain of custody controls on ballots, so that evidence is available and readily apparent to voters. Because what we see now is the threats to elections are really driven by driving this narrative of distrust and doubt rather than these sort of robust attacks, like actual cyber attacks against the process. And so empowering election officials to go out in their community, as you said, this community run, community operated, to go into their community and talk to them about the support they're getting. And what I can tell you is at the federal level, whether it's DHS, CISA, whether it's the FBI or others, there are literally hundreds of federal security experts that are out doing anything they can to support those election officials as they are the ones that run elections.
Thanks, Matt. Next up today, we'll have Nicole Tisdale, the founder of Advocacy Blueprints and a previous staffer at the White House National Security Council and the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Homeland Security. Nicole is an expert on a broad range of election threats, including especially mis and disinformation. So, Nicole, let me turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Garrett. And thanks to everybody at Aspen, but also everybody that's joined us today. Of course, I think this panel is very timely, but I also want to thank everybody for even coming to a panel to discuss these issues as we roll into the final weeks of the midterms. Just a little bit more about my background and some of the context So as Garrett mentioned, I worked on the House Homeland Security Committee in Congress for 10 years. And I was working on that committee in 2016 when we learned that there had been significant Russian interference with our elections. In the aftermath of 2016, some of the things that Matt mentioned, where you saw the coordination with state and local election officials, then post 2016 in the 2018 election, but also in the 2020 election, we kind of led the congressional response. And so one of the things that I was tasked with, as I tell people, I was in charge of the 3 C's when I worked on the committee, which is counterterrorism, cybersecurity, and counterintelligence, was making sure that our election officials had access to the resources and the information that they needed to be effective. And so, Garrett, to I guess your broader big question, which is what is different today than previously, one of the biggest things that we had to work hard for in Congress is to make sure that local and state election officials had transparency and the information they needed to do their jobs. And so I hate to keep taking everybody back, but if we go back to 2016, one of the biggest issues is that the necessary separation that we have between our federal election work and our federal investigations is the state and locals don't know when a foreign entity is interfering with our election. And when we say interference, we're talking about all the 3 pillars that they can look. That's cybersecurity, that's also physical threats, and then that's also disinformation. And so what we saw in 2016 in the aftermath, our entire election infrastructure was questioned, and people had questions and suspicions about the safety and security of our system. And so working with the executive branch in the years since, you now see us in a place, as Matt has referenced, where these are some of the most secure elections that we have ever had in our country. And we're not just saying that because we're trying to pat ourselves on the back. We did the hard work. We've talked through what those vulnerabilities were, and we have made efforts every year, not just when we have federal elections, but every year that we have elections, to make sure that we are doing the hard things to make sure that we are not vulnerable. But I think one of the things, and I hope we'll get a little bit more into this, Garrett, is, we do a good job of making sure that we are taking care of the hardware and the things that are a lot more tangible. But the disinformation piece is something that we have seen just really grow, and it's disproportionate to the other threats now. But it also gets us to a place where when the disinformation campaigns are at such a fever pitch as they are, it definitely endangers the physical safety of the people who are trying to do our elections and the administration of our elections. And so one of the things that I've been proud of that our government has stepped up, but also our civil society and really our civic engagement as a whole, which is talking about the disinformation in a way that people understand it, so people understand the broader context. These are campaigns. These are not one-off situations. These are sustained attacks of our democracy. And the ultimate goal of disinformation is to stop conversations, right? It is not, the goal of disinformation is not to try to get all of us on the same side of an issue. It's to get us to a place where we can't even have a conversation. We can't talk to people that have different viewpoints from us, and ultimately cast doubt on democracy as a whole. And I think over the last 6 years, there has been a very concerted effort of a whole of government, but whole of society approach to make sure that people understand, yes, this disinformation is a form of attack. And no, it's not kinetic. It's not done with weapons and guns, but it is just as dangerous to our democracy. And that's something that I've been really proud of, even once I went to the White House and we were on the I was on the National Security Council, just really keeping that focus and keeping that drive. And one of the things that I think what we see is, we're here, we're having this conversation today, but you've seen the government over the course of the 2022 midterms to be more transparent and to put out more information about what is going on and what they are seeing, what they are not seeing. Over the last month, you've seen CISA and FBI put out 4 intelligence bulletins where they are talking to people and they are saying, look, these are the types of things you may see. So get ready. You may see manipulated media, and the manipulated media may come in the form of a deep fake video or a deep fake audio. And this should be your response to this, or this is how you have the conversation. we just didn't have a government that was comfortable doing that in previous years. But now understanding like this is the threat and getting that information to people, getting it disclosed, getting it declassified, all of these things are part of the tools that we have in our toolbox now that are making for a more resilient society as a whole.
Thanks, Nicole. One thing I wanted to raise is the specter of political violence, as we have sort of seen that come into the forefront of at least thinking about election threats, particularly in the wake of January 6th. Can you give us some insight into how you thought about white supremacist militias and political violence around, democracy, around rallies, around elections, when you were at the National Security Council?
Yeah, I mean, so I came to the National Security Council after January 6th. So to say that this was at the forefront is an understatement, right? I live in Washington, D.C. I live down the street from the attack on the Capitol. And so one of the things that we had to do immediately is figure out how we are going to protect the people who are administrating our elections. And I say this, none of us will ever be able to thank everybody in our election infrastructure and the work that they have done over the last 6 years, but especially over the last 2 years. You have people who at their most basic level just want to see people participate in one of the strongest parts of our democracy, which is voting. And they've had to become lawyers. They've had to become law enforcement officers. They've had to become therapists. They've had to take on all of these roles that are just they are not the signs of a strong democracy. And so I think for us, I'm excited that we're finally at a place where we can have a conversation about some of these underlying grievances and themes that are allowing this disinformation to continue and to continue to be an issue. And a lot of that is the things that you see, these narratives, these tropes that are laced with white supremacy and their historic information that they are disinformation that they have put out. And for so long, I think in 2016 and 2018, people were afraid to say that. But now you're in a place where we're all in a place where we're like, not only do we need to talk to people about these campaigns and show like, yes, minority communities, people of color are being targeted by these campaigns, but also they are continuing to spread because these are real grievances that some of these disinformation campaigns are highlighting, right? Like these are not things, I always say that, the definition, this broad umbrella definition of disinformation is that it's false or misleading information. Well, y'all, some of the stuff is not false and it's not misleading. It's absolutely true. But the conversation now is about, let's talk about the grievances, but let's also make sure we're talking about the sources and the methods, right? Because the people who are continuing to push out this disinformation, they're not interested in addressing the racial, societal, class issues that we all are struggling with here in America. They are trying to say that our democracy doesn't work and our democratic systems don't work. And when I have these conversations with folks, I'm like, we need to talk about the grievances. We need to address the grievances, but I don't want anybody to ever think that there is any other system beyond a democracy where we even have a chance to address those grievances, address those issues. And I think it's been really important for us to finally say that. And it's hard, right? Because I don't always think the folks in the national security space should be the ones having the conversations about the underlying grievances. But I think what we've seen over the years is you cannot continue to divorce those issues because they are directly tied to each other.
Nicole, thanks so much for that. Let me move to our third and final speaker today, Tammy Patrick, a senior advisor to the elections program at the Democracy Fund and former federal compliance officer for Maricopa County Elections Department. Maricopa County, of course, and Arizona, a famously easy place to be an election official with very low drama. So, Tammy, let me turn it over to you.
Oh, if only that were the case. So thanks, Garrett. It's great to be here and to talk about these really important issues. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the effects of partisan election administration and how that can have an impact on the election outcome. So as Matt and Nicole have kind of mentioned, election administration has evolved a lot in the last 10 to 20 years. And although the great experiment really seeks to find or should seek to find the most effective ways to serve our voters and the most efficient ways to make sure that they're able to have free and fair access to the franchise. Far too often of late, it's been subject to changing political winds. We've seen the weaponization of election administration all across the board, from drop boxes to ballot curing, you name it, and people are using it as a way of attacking our democratic processes. So in the last two federal cycles, we've really seen an interesting impact on the increased awareness and protections around cybersecurity threats, as well as how to administer an election in a global pandemic. So it's been said before that, election officials started out being these kind of clerical roles, and then they needed to be IT managers, and then they needed to be technology specialists, and then cybersecurity specialists, and now, health experts, and in this moment, great communicators. So that's the challenge that we're experiencing right now, is that in election administration, it is just as dire, just as serious as attacks from sophisticated foreign nation states or a deadly microscopic virus, that voters are not being told the truth, rather, about the elections process. Their confidence is being undermined, and chaos is truly being fomented into violent threats and acts as a platform for more than 300 candidates running for the midterm election. So what happens if voters actually vote for them? Because again, this is all coming back to the power of the voter in this moment. So I think first, if we identify kind of where the areas of vulnerability are for partisan impact, or misguided partisan impact, I should say, because all across our elections process, we have bipartisan, multipartisan roles that are part of the checks and balances that we've relied upon historically. We've relied upon both parties, all parties, unaffiliated voters to come to the process with the correct motivations as poll workers, as local election officials, or on the boards of supervisors or commissioners, for state election officials like secretaries of state, state boards, and then also governors and attorneys general have roles that they play. So many of these positions are actually on the ticket, on the ballot in a couple of weeks, or currently, if you're in a state that's already started early voting. So when we hear about these candidates that run saying, I would not have certified the 2020 election, that's troubling. That's deeply problematic because, as was mentioned, the 2020 election was the most secure. It was also the most audited, the most transparent, the most observed, with the highest number of voters in U.S. history. And so instead of embracing all of the advances and the successes of 2020, unfortunately, we've had too many people that have gone unchecked, without accountability, and with increased incentives to keep their bases, I often say, engaged, enraged, and donating, right? The coffers are filling by people running on these platforms. So with that said, there are things I take solace in. I do sleep some at night. It's getting smaller and smaller segments as we get closer to election day. But here's why I can take solace in the thousands of election professionals that are conducting our elections with the help and aid of their communities, of our neighbors, our friends and family members that are basically volunteering because they're underpaid to do this job. And that is that partisan composition at all levels of the process. We also have the varying levels of approval, of oversight, and quality control. So if you think about at the polls, you have poll workers of many different party affiliations. You have the county or municipal election officials that are overseeing those poll workers to make sure that what they're doing is correct and checking their work, as it were. And you also have the state overseeing what's happening at the local level. So when you have a county commission like in Otero County that says, I know we hand counted everything. We did a hand count audit and the machines tabulated properly, but I don't want to certify this because I just know in my gut it's not right. The evidence doesn't demonstrate there was a problem with the election, but I know in my heart that I don't want to, certify this election. That's where the state steps in. So you have these varying levels of approval. And then you also have the court backing this up, right? So no matter what happens in the upcoming election, if there are rogue actors, who decide they're going to somehow attempt to declare winners when the votes are not there. If there are rogue actors who, quote unquote, seek to find additional ballots and additional votes that are not, in their win column, it's all going to go to the courts. I mean, the true winners will raise hell, I hope. And those who lose, those candidates who are already saying, oh, there's no possible way I couldn't win. I'm not going to say now that, I'll abdicate, or I'll concede if I don't win, because the only way I couldn't win is if there's fraud. That is a platform for far too many candidates. And I'm hopeful that voters are paying attention in this moment, that is a red flag. That is someone who, in many cases has said they would not have certified the 2020 free and fair election. And that should give voters some pause, because if they vote for those individuals who believe that, in 2024, it could very well be the case that there are individuals in elected offices and in positions of power to try and exert their own undue influence on the outcome of the election. But I will say that with all of that, because that sounds really dire, even though we know there are close to 300 or more candidates running on this, for me, where I am the most concerned is where there are a slate of actors, right? So if you have one rogue county attorney or one rogue county supervisor, or a secretary of state in a state, or a governor in a state that has this kind of proclivity, that's one thing. You have those other checks and balances. But when you have an entire slate of candidates, like unfortunately my former state of Arizona, if those individuals all get elected, then I think all bets are off, because you are losing some of the checks and balances within the election structure. And that's where we will have to fall back on the checks and balances in the court system. And unfortunately, I think in the last couple of months, we've seen where there are some problems even within the courts. And so I think there'll be a lot of appeals. And if things end up at the Supreme Court, I'm not sure if there's anyone who is very confident in what that outcome might actually be.
Tammy, thank you. That was a very worrisome summary, capping off two equally not super encouraging conversations with Matt and Nicole. Reminder to our audience, we're going to turn to audience questions here in just a minute. Feel free to put your questions into the Q&A function here on Zoom if you're watching on Zoom. Let me ask you a question, Tammy, and then bring in the other panelists for a question round or two. One of the things that we have seen at the federal level play out over the course of this year has been some attempts to close and reform some, loopholes and challenges in our election system that the 2020 experience made clear to us, including the Electoral Count Act that's working its way through the legislative process right now. I wonder if you, Tammy, could talk a little bit about how encouraged you are by those reforms, how much are those reforms sort of focused on the right things, and what more you think we sort of should be trying to do at a national level to address the local challenges of election administration.
It's a great question. And I think one of the things that has been the most surprising to me in the last couple of years has been the exposure of how much we were relying on democratic norms around things like conceding, peaceful transitions of power, the sort of things that if someone had told me 10 or even 15 years ago that this is where we would be in the future is, not having those things, I would have been surprised and I would have been dismissive of such an outrageous claim, because we do rely on some of those things that are really quite vague. And I think that the exposure of some of those failings in the Electoral Count Act have been exposed. I think that the proposal addresses many of them. If you get two people in a room, you're going to get two different opinions on whether or not it goes far enough or it goes too far. I think that part of the challenge that we have in election administration is that you do have these structures where you have state election officials and local election officials. And oftentimes, even though federal law requires or states that a state chief election official is a chief election official in federal law and has responsibilities under federal law, oftentimes within many of the states, they don't have enforcement powers over the local authorities that are conducting the elections. And so there's a tension there, and there's a challenge on where exactly we can rest the correct responsibility and enforcement of any of these statutes. And so that continues to be a challenge. And I think some states like Colorado just, passed legislation that I think many states need to be looking at that really address some of the gaps in state law around things like, what do you do if a county doesn't certify an election? What do you do if there is an insider threat like they experienced in Colorado? And I think because we have moved into this new environment, a lot of legislators and policy specialists are rethinking how specific do we need to be in some of these instances. And I think what we're discovering is that we need to be pretty specific because that ambiguity that we relied on the past of everyone kind of coming to the conversation with the proper and the correct motivations, we are experiencing individuals coming without proper motivations that are truly only there to try and gain and or keep power in a way that I think is undermining the way in which we think about our democracy. It's reflective of how we see emerging democracies, or those who are pretending to be emerging democracies, perhaps approach some of these similar kind of questions.
Matt, Tammy sort of talked a lot here about how the environment has shifted from 2020 to 2022. You talked about how 2016, how 2020 had shifted from 2016. You were part of the DHS team in 2020 that declared that election the most secure election in U.S. history. And I wonder if, again, understanding you're now outside of government, so have a slightly different perspective, how confident are you in terms of this election being more or less secure than 2 years ago?
Yeah, my perspective on that hasn't changed. And to be clear, the declaration of most secure election in American history, which has gotten so much attention, wasn't just CISA or Chris Krebs even. It was a combination of state and local election officials that are on the government coordinating council, and then election system providers as well. So this was the community as a whole speaking, right? Not just the federal government or CISA. And that statement, just from objective facts, was true. We had more threat intelligence information sharing. We had more paper ballots and audits that were going on. We had more multi-factor authentication, more penetration testing of election systems. Election officials had exercised response plans more, and those efforts have only continued. And so the statement wasn't meant to throw a line in the sand to say that no election will ever be more secure moving forward, but in fact to say we've made a ton of progress since 2016. There are objective things we can point to, like paper ballots and audits, like improvements to cybersecurity, the physical security reviews, the steps election officials had taken to update systems and push out outdated or unsupported systems, things like that. And that's only continued, right? That investment, that support. And so I have confidence in the election community. I have confidence in the state and federal and local officials that have been working on this around the clock since 2020. It's not like the attention, the scrutiny has stopped. As Tammy said, this was the most scrutinized, the most audited, the most litigated election in history. Not always a positive experience for election officials, but what I know about that community is it forces them to look inward and say, how can I improve? Where can we improve the security? Where can we improve transparency so that I could offer voters more evidence of the integrity of the process? And so I have every reason to believe that this this election will be equally, if not more secure. And that investment will continue moving forward because it's a priority for election officials. And I hope the main concern is I hope we as a society, I hope local funders, state funders, federal funders will all invest appropriately, because election officials can only continue to improve and progress to the extent they have the resources, both manpower and money, to continue to further secure the election.
Nicole, in talking about disinformation and misinformation, we haven't really talked about the role of the social media platforms here. And one of the audience questions from Jenny Garman is about the ways that the government works with the social media companies to target and identify foreign agents and deliberate creators of disinformation. Here we are, Wednesday, October 26th. In sometime in the next 48 hours, Elon Musk is expected to become the sort of sole owner and grand overlord of Twitter. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the ways that you have seen, in good and bad, the social media companies sort of step up to this moment.
Sure. So I could talk for hours about my thoughts about Elon Musk buying Twitter, but this is not that panel. I would say, even if no one asked, but if I had to give the social media companies a grade, I would probably give them like a D and needs improvement. That's my former substitute teacher coming out, because I think what we've seen the social media companies do is show us outside of elections that they are capable of putting some of these protections in place. And so I think about the campaigns that went around at the very beginning of COVID, where they were actively taking down things. They were also reporting to the government and sharing information about some of the foreign interference or foreign messaging that they were seeing. And they were able to distinguish that and say, like, this is what we're seeing from the domestic side. This is what we're seeing coming in from foreign actors. I would say their hesitation and just flat out reluctance to do that when it comes to election is really just them taking like a cheap shot, right? Because they'll fall back and say that there are things that they can't do. But we know actually there are. And Color of Change, actually, they had a fellow that did a really good report on this, where you had Color of Change that had been in a lot of civil rights and civil liberties organizations that have been asking the social media companies to put some of these protections in place as it relates to election security for years. And they kept saying, we physically cannot do it. We can't do it from a technological standpoint. And then magically, when COVID, especially in 2020, like reached its peak, you start seeing them roll out all of these tools. I would say that showed, from my point of view, that showed it can be done, but there has to be a will there. And right now there isn't a will. I think the place and the space that you see government, where government really does get to these firewalls where they cannot go any further, right? So when we talk about what is the role of national security in these law enforcement organizations, I always warn people, be careful what you are asking your government to start doing in terms of policing, because these are things that are not easily rolled back. And as a Black woman, I'm always very uncomfortable with asking our national security apparatus to start anything that looks remotely like invading civil rights and civil liberties as it relates to privacy and freedom of speech. But the tech companies are not under these same requirements. And so I hate when I see the social media companies. I hate when I see the social media companies ducking under the cover of the First Amendment, right? Where it's like, well, First Amendment rights. And I always remind people, I'm like, first of all, if I'm giving out advice on con law, we're in like a very difficult place. It's taking me back to law school. The social media companies are not bound by the First Amendment. The First Amendment is there to protect us from government overreach. Like, the government cannot prohibit our freedom of speech. The social media companies, these are their terms. Like, you can create the terms for which people can use your platform, and you can enforce that. And so I would definitely give the social media companies a D when it comes to this, because while disinformation is not new, right? We've seen disinformation campaigns, especially in Black communities, go back to 1930s and the 1920s. it is not new, but social media allows it to target these communities in a way that is micro, it's fast, and it's overwhelming. And so you have people who are showing up in November who have been targeted with disinformation about their vote not mattering, that the whole system is corrupt, and they've been targeted for years, right? Like, this isn't something that just started in October. This isn't something that started in September. And so we're gonna have to get to a place where I think we've asked long enough for the social media companies to do something. We're gonna have to do that piece, that other check and balance that Tammy talked about, which is regulation, right? Because when you don't do what is being asked of you, the regulations are the penalty, because we've tried the carrot, and so now we're at the stick.
Nicole, that actually segues great into the next question from the audience here. And a reminder, if you have any questions as an audience member and you're here on the Zoom side, feel free to drop it into the Q&A function on Zoom. And I want to turn to Tammy for this next question from Lanier about what are you seeing in terms of public opinion trends around election integrity? We're sort of in this weird moment where we are seeing record turnout in a lot of elections, and yet also a lot of sort of sturm and drang in the political system about the election being rigged, the people not being able to count on their vote being counted. How much are you seeing this actually affect voters, Tammy, and how much are you sort of worried about the larger effects, the larger effectiveness of mis and disinformation around and malign influence operations around election integrity?
So that's an excellent question. And one of the challenges is the use of the word integrity itself, right? So in this moment, similar to what we saw in the mid-2000s, election integrity is almost a code word to try and undermine any sort of faithful conversation around the legitimacy of our elections. By implying that they lack any integrity at all, and putting election officials and others more on the defensive than being able to talk offensively about all the things that they're doing to protect the process. What we are seeing is that, and I mentioned earlier, this kind of weaponization around certain types of election administration, often being used by these same groups that claim that they are purporting for election integrity. And so they're going after things like vote by mail, or the use of ballot drop boxes, or any myriad of election administrative policies that have been best practices in states all across the country, and oftentimes for decades. So what we are seeing is that they are having an effect, perhaps not on the overall turnout of voters, but voters' behavior is changing. And we started seeing this in 2020 when then President Trump was calling into doubt anyone voting by mail, or whether or not it was okay to vote absentee, but not by mail, which of course in almost every state that is the exact same thing. And we saw voters shifting their voting method. When we look at a state like Arizona, they've had more voters come off their permanent or automatic voting by mail list than ever in the history of the list, which started in 2007. So voters are hearing this narrative that is telling them that a certain way of voting or a certain channel of voting is ripe with fraud, and that if they vote in that way, their vote won't count, or it'll be cast into doubt. And so they are reacting to it. So we won't know until after the election is completely over and done with whether or not it's had a depression on overall turnout. We do know that voter registration is high. We've seen increases in voter registration in many, many, many states. We know that in a lot of cases, even when there are laws that are passed that are more restrictive and that put barriers in front of voters, traditionally, research has shown that can actually drive turnout, because I often say you should never underestimate the tenacity of the American voter, because they shouldn't have to have that tenacity in order to participate in the franchise. But oftentimes when more hurdles are put in front of them, they are more willing to break down those hurdles in almost, strong indignation of someone trying to take that right away from them. At least that's what I'm hopeful of. And so I think that's part of where we're sitting at in this moment, is that the mis and disinformation is fueling this distrust in the system as a whole. And for some voters, that might be a turnoff. Other voters, it might be a motivation. And in some cases, we just aren't going to know until after the election is over what the actual impact has been. So we have polling, we have other things that, we know that traditionally voters believe the integrity of their local election is good, that they trust their local election officials in most cases. And then as you look to across the state, it's not as high a trust. And then nationally, the trust goes down. I think those trends are holding, but what we're seeing is that the level of trust is coming down in all of those factions. And that is deeply troubling. So this narrative is taking hold, unfortunately.
So. Let me put one final question here to Matt, and then we'll do a quick wrap-up round. Thank you all for joining us today for this great conversation. Matt, a question from Dina Temple-Raston of the Click Here podcast. How much does open source software and groups like Voting Works help boost transparency and trust? Any comment about what they are doing in New Hampshire with their machines there?
Yeah, I think there are really interesting questions around that. We haven't seen open source technology as a whole implemented in elections widely, so I don't know that we know. In fairness and openness, Microsoft announced Election Guard, which is an end-to-end verifiable PKI that's open source as well, to try to support greater transparency and verification of elections. I think this is an avenue that we're going to continue to see explored, not just from the Voting Works folks, but others in embrace of transparency. And again, I think whether or not it's open source, whether or not it's greater availability of election data. I know there are election officials out there looking at ways to open up the process more. An embrace of transparency and participation is part of the evidence that's going to have to be offered. We're in a situation in which not only in some cases is the loser not accepting that they lost, but in fact openly hostile to the results, regardless of what the vote totals and audits show. And so the response from election officials has been one of, okay, what other avenues can I present information, evidence to voters such that they are prepared and pre-bunked to whatever narratives may come about after the election. And so open source technology and open source software very well may be one of those avenues. Again, we haven't seen it sort of widely deployed yet. I think there's some really interesting possibilities there, not just in the voting system realm, where I think we tend to focus, but also around other election technology. But then just additional avenues of transparency that election officials can empower voters on, but also can't be leveraged negatively. We saw videos, for instance, in counting rooms used and manipulated to push narratives of stealing ballots, rigging and dumping ballots, things like that. And so knowing what you're introducing, knowing what that transparency control, what narratives may come, but recognizing that voters as part of this conversation are asking for evidence, I think is really, really important. And innovation is important. And I think open source technology is one avenue of innovation, as is end-to-end verification, I think, to begin to embrace that evidence that we need to offer voters.
Great. Thanks. So I wanted to ask one roundup question here to wrap us up today. And I'll come to Nicole first, then Tammy, then Matt. What is your advice for a voter, citizen, and news consumer in the 24 to 72 hours after the end of voting in about 2 weeks' time? Like, what should people be looking for? What should people be worried about? What are going to be the warning signs that you're paying attention to that something has gone awry or that the system is working as expected in the hours after the polls close and the voting count and certification process begins? Nicole?
Sure. I think what I would say in like the shortest amount of terms is stay calm, right? So one of the things that I've been trying to do is I've been talking to people about election security is like be realistic about what we are expecting from our elections. I think it's important to talk to people and say, we are never saying everything is going to be 100%, because if you start at a place where everything has to be 100%, if you hear any questions or if there are any suspicions, then the whole system is rigged, is insane, right? Like if we have this, our elections, the metaphor would be like, this is a big ship. The whole ship is not going to go down because we spring one leak. But what you're going to have to do in the 72 hours, the 48 hours, and maybe even the week after the election is stay calm as we go through these processes so that we can certify our elections. I think one of the things that has happened over the years, and I say this as an 80s baby who remembers very clearly that like you used to go to bed and you knew who won elections. Things have changed over time. And so in order for us to make sure these things are as safe as possible, and technology is changing, information is changing, we want to be able to take our time to certify results. And that may mean that you have to go to bed without knowing who won an election. That does not mean that the elections are unsafe or that the elections are rigged. And so if we have a leak in the boat, know that we have the systems, we have the checks and the balances in place that we can still certify the results. And I think as long as people come with that approach, it's going to keep down the hysteria, because for me, that's the thing that I'm most worried about, is that people think that taking the time to certify results and certify the election means that something is wrong. And that's not the case. That's not the case in any other part of our life. And that's not going to be the case for the elections.
Tammy?
Building off of that, because that was beautifully stated, on election night, it's a question of the media feeling comfortable in forecasting who the winners are going to be. Across the states, official results are not done until, in the earliest, I think, is 3 days. Matt will correct me if I'm wrong here, in Delaware. And California doesn't certify for 28 days for every federal election. Nothing changes. It's just the process. And the question is it a close race and the press is comfortable enough to declare a winner? Or is it a blowout, or is it really, really tight and they don't feel comfortable making that claim and then being wrong a week later or 2 weeks later, what have you? So we need to make sure that we are staying calm. If you want to be part of that election night excitement, get your ballots back in early, go and vote in early. Early action is the key in all of this. But we do need to make sure that we're giving election officials that space to conduct the work that they need to do. I often think about the final seconds in a basketball game when the shot is off. Does the ball go through after the timer has gone out? It doesn't matter if we're counting ballots after election day, as long as it was cast, as long as that shot got off in time. So we need to make sure that all the points are counted and that the correct winners are declared. So patience is definitely going to be a virtue moving forward.
Matt, your final thoughts.
Yeah, always dangerous to leave me last with the wrap-up comment, but I appreciate the event. I agree completely with the conversation. There's two areas specifically that I'm looking at for either warning signs or optimism. And right now it's optimism. The first is early voting and absentee voting that we're seeing right now. These are early indicators. If there were problems, if we saw some sort of cyber issues with data or manipulation, we'd see that in the early voting period. And thus far, what we've seen is robust participation, which is the best case scenario for early and absentee voting. So continuing to watch the administration of the absentee and early voting process as states continue to open up and have their voters participate early, I think is really important. And then as we saw in 2020, sort of the alerts, warnings, and the specificity of the alerts and warnings coming from the threat intelligence community, the national security community. We saw in 2020 the national security community in partnership with election officials get out in front of the Iranian activity, right? Went out, and within 27 hours of that activity being reported from election officials, you had a press conference in which there was attribution to Iran and warnings to voters about sort of what that looked like and to continue to participate. And so I would say continuing to pay attention to some of those signals to see if there's activity either from nation state adversaries or otherwise is really important. And then the final thing, and it's a point of optimism, and it's a credit, Garrett, to folks like yourself and your colleagues in journalism. Unlike in even 2016, and certainly when I started in 2006, I'm an old man now in elections, the amount of experts and reporters covering this issue at the national level, but at the local level as well, has expanded exponentially, and they've really dug in. We saw that in Arizona from the local reporters and the national reporters around the cyber ninjas to understand the nuance, the details. And so encouraging those reporters in this time that we have before Election Day and afterwards to do two things. One, go meet with your election officials if you haven't already, understand the process. They're busy, but they'll open their doors to you. And then two, take some time within your editorial preparations to red team out. What narratives do we expect to see? You can expect to see vote by mail narratives and as Tammy flagged, results narratives, things like that. And anticipating and getting pre-bunking and flooding the zone now with factual information about those processes is really important at the local level, at the national level, so the voters can know, okay, I've heard about this already. I've already been given information about this and I can have confidence. And then finally, for voters, know that election officials are working day in and day out to ensure a safe, secure process. So go participate. It is absolutely the best response to all of this. Thank you.
Matt, Nicole, Tammy, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to my colleagues Beth Semmel and Tasha Overpeck for their work putting together this session for Aspen Digital. And thank you to the Hewlett Foundation for their support of this event and so many other organizations' work to help bolster our democracy. I want to close with 3 reminders today. First, you can join us virtually on November 3rd at 7 p.m. for a program about disinformation and the midterm elections co-hosted with 92Y that will feature founding CISA director Chris Krebs in conversation with Cecilia Kang of the New York Times. And that also please join us on November 16th in person or online for the Aspen Cyber Summit, where actually we'll be featuring some conversations looking back at the election, hoping that by November 16th, actually large portions of the election will be behind us. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Garrett Graff from Aspen Digital. Have a great afternoon.